Hey everybody, another video for you. Hope everyone's doing well. I am still limping around on these broken toes, but otherwise, I guess I'm doing okay. Um, Lots to discuss. Yesterday, I did a video just about really taking on some of the talking points of the allegedly anti-war left, those that, in my view, deliberately, maybe not deliberately, maybe deliberately, maybe not deliberately, mischaracterize the war either through cynical desire to uphold Russia's talking points or through a complete lack of understanding of the nature of the war, maybe both. So I tried to delve into that and give some details on that. That one's available on the YouTube channel, on Facebook, on Counterpunch, everywhere, basically, everywhere that my stuff will appear. So you can find that there. This, of course, is going to be my usual update on some of the stories related to the war in Ukraine and Russia, of course, related to Russia, that are either being reported and not talked about enough or deserve a little bit more attention. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of stories here today. I have a few more that I want to cover, maybe in a video later, maybe in a video tomorrow. We'll see. But I am trying to get back into the swing of videos at least a couple of times a week. So anyway, thank you for everyone who's been patient with me as my output has dropped in the last couple months. All right. First story I want to focus on here is a new law among many in Russia. I've done videos talking about the laws related to LGBTQ, quote unquote, propaganda, laws related to discrediting Russia's armed forces, which basically means criminalization of dissent, related to all sorts of different aspects of Russian life, and specifically talking about the ways in which Putin's invasion has now accelerated what was already sort of the process of making Russia even more of an authoritarian state. To some degree, Russia did have at least a semblance of democratic institutions, maybe even if just as a veneer. That's pretty much been stripped away completely, as many things are now being outlawed. And so now let's talk about a new law that is coming into effect. And this one doesn't so much outlaw things as provides immunity. So Russia has now officially passed through the lower house of its parliament a bill that would essentially provide immunity for all crimes committed by Russians and their proxies in the war in Ukraine. So, specifically, according to the language of the bill, this would grant immunity for crimes committed before September 30th, so before Russia officially I guess you could say, took control, quote unquote, of some of these annexed territories. So this bill would provide immunity to all Russian soldiers, Russian generals, Russian contractors, mercenaries, etc., for basically anything that they did in Ukraine, whether summary executions or raping of children or whatever it might be. These crimes are now potentially going to be these criminals are going to be immune from prosecution. Now, this obviously has multiple effects. Both one, reassuring those that are all clearly criminals that are operating in Ukraine that they can continue to do so. They don't need to fear legal reprisals. They can just sort of continue doing what they do rather than potentially deserting or selling their gear and trying to make their way to Europe or whatever has been happening. We've heard all kinds of reports. So that's one, right? And by the way, the language of the bill is important because it describes immunity basically for anybody who is, quote, acting in the interest of the Russian Federation, close quote. Obviously, an open ended characterization that could basically be applied to almost any kind of crime. So this will cover Russian officials, it will cover their families, it will cover their proxies, both Russian and non-Russian. This will become a law after it's been passed through the Federation Council, which is the upper house of parliament. I'm not going to get into the whole Russian governmental reorganization that Putin has undertaken in the last 6 months, but needless to say, the lower house of parliament has passed it. The upper house is soon to pass it. Putin will then provide his signature, and that will be that. It will become law. The bill, and this is, I think, probably the most important point for our purposes, the bill is blatantly illegal according to international law. It violates multiple provisions of the Geneva Convention, including Article 64 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which provides that local laws apply even under instances of occupation. In other words, the Russians, having invaded Ukraine and occupied parts of Ukraine, are still, according to the Geneva Convention, are still bound by Ukrainian law and by international law. In other words, the Russians are now about to pass a law that effectively invalidates the Geneva Convention, which of course it doesn't invalidate it. It simply formally legalizes Russia's contravention of the Geneva Convention. Russia is violating international law. That's clear. They've been doing it from the moment that they stepped foot in Ukraine. In fact, you could argue that they've been doing it since 2014, but that's a separate issue. The point being, they are violating international law. They are violating the Geneva Convention. And now they are passing a law that essentially codifies that violation of the Geneva Convention into Russian law. This, I think, gets at a maybe even a broader issue of does international law even exist? Has it broken down? And part of the reason I bring this up is because the United States has never really abided by international law. The United States is a criminal regime top to bottom. So, there is a question of whether international law ever meant anything. And to the extent that it did it ever even apply to the United States? I mean, clearly the United States is in violation of international law in just about every instance of its use of military force in the last 75 years. The United States is a serial violator of the Geneva Convention and of international law, lest I remind people of extraordinary rendition, waterboarding, the entire war in Iraq, the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, the torture, the killings, the mass killings, the highway of death in Iraq in 19. I mean, I could go on and on and on. The crimes in Panama. I mean, Grenada. We could go on and on. Vietnam, of course, and many, many other examples. So at a I guess theoretical level, one could make the argument that there never really has been international law, or rather that there's been one set of international law for all countries in the world and then another set for the United States. I would agree. I would agree. This is the nature of US imperialism, that it exists above international law. But, and here's where the big BUT, big butt, comes in. Who cares? The United States is a criminal regime. The left does not support the United States. The left does not support the US government. The left does not support US imperialism. I would argue that every US president is a war criminal and has been for at least the last 9 decades. I would argue that the US is a criminal power that absolutely breaks international law repeatedly. Where I'm going to disagree with some is the idea that because the United States does that, it's okay for Russia to do that. That Russia can act the way that the United States does. In other words, that Russia's crimes, like US crimes, are acceptable, but they are not. This is precisely the point. These assholes who claim to be on the left, who claim to be anti-war, they constantly hang their hat on the idea that Putin is doing nothing any different from what the United States does. And my response to that is exactly. That's precisely what makes him a criminal and a murderer and somebody who deserves to be at the Hague facing war crimes charges, for the same reason that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and all of the rest of them all also deserve to be in The Hague. There is no subjectivity when it comes to these issues. There is only the objective reality that international law and human rights and all of these things matter, and that we on the left who are truly anti-war are supposed to apply those principles equally across the board. If the US criminal regime does it, it is a crime. If the Russian criminal regime does it, it is a crime. This kind of universal application of I don't know, our values, our principles. This is what I want. This is what I'm looking for. I want people who see the world and reality for what it is and aren't trying to play some pissing contest about what the United States does makes it acceptable for another country. All right, that digression aside, it also this new Russian bill also violates Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, which guarantees the right for a remedy to anyone whose rights have been violated. The law granting immunity effectively precludes any Ukrainian from seeking justice for legal remedy for crimes committed against them. Russian soldiers have kicked in the door to my house in a village in Ukraine. They have destroyed all of my property. They have raped my daughter. They have raped my wife. They've cut off my hand and left me a broken man with a broken life. And I can't even take them to court when this war is over. That's what we're talking about here. And I mean, I made that up, obviously, but that is exactly the kind of scenario that thousands and thousands of Ukrainians are facing. Those kinds of barbaric acts, those crimes, they have been perpetrated and they're being perpetrated probably as we speak. And the fact that this new law will prevent any Ukrainian or anybody else from taking the Russians to court and seeking reparations of some kind, that's a big problem. All right, let me continue here. Well, let me leave the war stuff to the very end. Let me talk about this story, very interesting. Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, who is famously on the US sanctions list, one of the most significant of all of the Russian oligarchs. Deripaska is an interesting figure because while he definitely figured into the whole Russiagate web of insanity with many, many different connections and all kinds of stuff. Deripaska has presented himself, at least publicly, as something of a Putin critic when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Deripaska has made statements publicly last spring and again in the summer regarding more or less that the war in Ukraine is a mistake and that it would be a tremendous mistake for the Russians to destroy Ukraine. Now, this is the kind of thing that doesn't fly in Russia. Putin doesn't care, even if you're a billionaire oligarch. If you make those kinds of statements publicly, they will come after you. And in fact, they are. Nobody, including one of the primary oligarchs, is above that. So, oligarch Deripaska owns a hotel complex in Sochi, which famously, was the site of the Russian Winter Olympics. It's a resort, coastal resort city, destination for tourists, etc. So he owns this complex in Sochi, and that complex has now been seized by the Russian government, worth over $1 billion. Okay, now there was a legal dispute between Deripaska's company and the government prior to the invasion in February of 2022. However, many, including people close to, sources close to the Kremlin, are making it pretty well known that Deripaska's loss in court and the loss of this asset is directly connected to his having spoken out against the war. Is he speaking out against the war, or is he speaking out against Putin's prosecution of the war and decision making? Who knows? Who cares? Now, the broader question and the real reason why I figured this story was worth paying attention to is, what does this mean for Putin's support within the Russian elite circles? Deripaska is not a nobody. I mean, this is one of the most influential and most important and richest of the Russian oligarchs. And for Putin and his government to move against Deripaska, knowing that Deripaska knows where a lot of bodies are buried himself and that he has all kinds of connections internationally, this, I think, signals that the Russian government is unafraid of these oligarchs, that there is very little that the oligarchs are going to be able to do. Now, the reason why that's important is because there were many in the United States and in the West who had harbored delusions, dare I say, fantasies about the collapse of the Russian state, and that the collapse of the Russian state might be precipitated by some kind of a revolt from within the oligarch class. But we see no evidence of a revolt within the oligarch class. What we do see, in fact, is Putin seemingly taking preemptive steps to make sure there is no revolt among the oligarchs, among the wealthy elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And by seizing this, I think it's a very clear warning shot to every other oligarch who might think maybe now would be a good time to open my mouth and to voice a little criticism. I think not. Okay. And by the way, I would just also say it may also, and maybe we're reading a little bit too much into this, I don't know, but it may also indicate a little bit of weakness on the part of Putin, that he has to keep his oligarchs in line, that he can't keep them in line through victories on the battlefield, through rhetoric or anything else, that he has to take direct legal action. The other piece of this that's interesting is the monetary side of this. As everybody knows, Russia lost hundreds of billions in its cash reserves that were frozen the minute that the United States began the economic side of this war. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US and its European allies not only implemented sanctions, but of course, a raft of economic measures that have significantly harmed Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war and Russia's ability to have a functional and stable economy. And so, we've seen in various ways the Russian government scrambling to get its hands on as much, as much financial power as it can. That is why we've had reports of them stealing African gold in some of these countries where Russia's advisors are present, in places like Sudan and Mali and Burkina Faso, where diamonds and minerals and iron ore and all kinds of other things that are money makers for the Russians. Sanctions and the international economic situation and the international financial system from which the Russians have basically been frozen out has now forced them into a position where they are scrambling for resources. Now, does this mean that the Russian government is going to collapse? No. Is the economy going to collapse? No. The Russian elites are simply going to transfer the pain onto the working class and the poor, as they've always done, as they've done for the last 20 plus years. That's precisely what's going to happen again. So, in other words, now you have a situation where the Russians are scrambling for resources, financial resources, and are now, in a sense, cannibalizing their own oligarchs. It's an interesting dynamic that's playing out there. Okay, let me turn now to this issue of a winter offensive. So there's a lot of talk that the Russians may potentially launch a winter offensive in Ukraine. But the recent reporting, now I saw this in the Moscow Times. I believe this was reported in the Associated Press. I'd have to go back and look where the original story appeared. But the reporting is basically that there are conflicts inside of the Kremlin about whether or not an offensive on Ukraine in the winter is a good idea. That there's basically two camps. The first camp that advocates in favor of an offensive in Ukraine wants to pursue the offensive as hard, as quickly as possible, with the idea that perhaps they could end the war by taking Kyiv. Ultimately, the idea of a winter offensive with the intent of seizing the capital and deposing the government. In other words, exactly what they wanted to do last February and failed miserably at doing. So the second camp is basically saying no. They're questioning the ability of Russia to actually carry out any kind of an offensive in winter with frozen ground and the Ukrainian forces fighting on their home turf, already having dug into defensive positions, right? So there's the second camp is basically saying what a disaster that would be. Let us please not blunder our way into yet another chaotic mess like we did last winter. Okay, so Ukrainian generals, on the other hand, are warning the offensive is coming. They're warning that the Russians are waiting for the freeze, the permanent ground freeze, and then rolling into Kyiv. I don't know. I would say that is insane, utterly insane for the Russians to even consider such a an offensive. They will be absolutely smashed. So I would say, no way are the Russians going to do that. It makes no sense strategically. They will lose and they will be hammered and it will be catastrophic. And yet, I said the same thing about the invasion in February of 2022, and they went through with it. So I don't know. I would like to say that the Russians are still reasonable and rational and can look at the situation and recognize that it will be an unmitigated disaster if they do that. And yet, the whole war is an unmitigated disaster, and they've pursued it and they've, doubled down and tripled down on it. So I don't know. We may, in fact, see an offensive. The rumors are that Putin went to Belarus to meet with Lukashenko in preparation for an offensive directed from Belarus, from the northern route south into Ukraine and into Kyiv. Um, Maybe he's bluffing. Maybe he goes to Lukashenko to give the appearance that they're preparing an offensive when in fact they aren't. I don't know. I cannot pretend to have a crystal ball and I cannot pretend to know what Putin is thinking. Again, from my perspective, that is a strategic blunder of historic proportions. It will imperil the entire Russian military adventure. And frankly, I would welcome the collapse of the Russian military in a disastrous campaign to try to take Kiev. On the flip side, I don't think that's likely. I think it's bluff, but who knows? All right. Finally, let me finish up today. Talk a little bit about Putin's messaging on the war. A couple of interesting statements that he's made recently, and I'm not going to get into all of the details of each statement. I'm not going to read them word for word, but basically, ultimately, Putin is prepping the Russian people for a protracted, long-term war in Ukraine. He recently made the statement that the war is becoming, quote, extremely complicated, which is another way of saying don't expect an end to this war anytime soon. So this is now the second time that he's, floated this little rhetorical trial balloon to convince people, that the war is not going to end anytime soon. In fact, earlier this month, he told the Russian Human Rights Council that that the invasion and the war would be a, quote, long process. Okay, Putin doesn't accidentally use these sorts of phrases. These are planned talking points. They are designed to seed the discourse in Russia to prepare people for a protracted war of attrition that will hammer their economy, continue to hammer their economy, continue to lower their standards of living. Right? Putin knows that economic pain is coming even more for Russian people, and he needs to prepare them for it. This is part of the problem that Russia has had. Nobody was truly prepared, rhetorically or in terms of the propaganda, truly prepared for the announcement of that partial mobilization in September, essentially the draft in Russia. It was a disaster, public relations disaster. And I think using that lesson, the Russians are now trying to just sort of lay the groundwork to casually and over a longer period of time show that this war is not going to end. And it's probably not going to end today, tomorrow, or the day after that. And it might be your children who aren't even yet of soldiering age who may ultimately be going to fight. Putin also addressed security and intelligence services and made a couple of interesting statements. He basically told them to be vigilant against traitors, spies, and saboteurs. Now, two things to make of this. The first is that he is 100% serious. He does need his intelligence and security services to pay attention to saboteurs. Sabotage has, well, we've seen many examples of sabotage already inside of Russia at weapons depots and waterways, that dam that was exploded, and many other examples, power plants, the chemicals factory, all these very, very, very convenient accidents, right? So on the one hand, Putin is basically saying, hey, I need you all to stop that. I can't have that happening anymore. It's embarrassing for us. So that's, sort of on the surface level, he means what he's saying. Please be vigilant about that. But at another level, there's something else going on here. This is the transition into, whether you want to call it a fascist state, a totalitarian state, or what have you. Russia is shedding whatever pretenses it had to any kind of democratic rights at all for people. So now you have the security services basically being given carte blanche to more or less root out whoever they believe to be traitors and spies and saboteurs, right? This is very Stalin. This is very much like the kind of activity, the kind of governmental bureaucratic structures that Stalin employed. So, and it's interesting that Putin also recently tried to draw a direct connection between himself and Stalin by pointing out that his grandfather allegedly was Stalin's cook. I don't know if that's true or not. It's probably not true, but the propaganda effect is what I'm interested in. The idea that Putin is a direct descendant, not in terms of, blood descendant, but a descendant in terms of the legacy of Stalin. Right. And in fact, this myth making around Stalin has been one of the central propaganda tools that Putin has used throughout his time as president. The rehabilitation of Stalin, the creation of something like a cult of Stalin. Right. Stalin is revered in modern Russia, despite the fact that Lenin is treated as garbage. Lenin's legacy is trampled upon. Lenin's ideas of self-determination for Ukraine are seen as backward, are seen as quite literally the creation of the problem in Ukraine. So it is interesting that Stalin looms large, and Putin wants association and connection to Stalin, the strong man, the Russian nationalist, right? Even though he allegedly was a Marxist and a Bolshevik. Well, not allegedly, he was a Marxist and a Bolshevik, but also a Russian chauvinist, which is precisely what Lenin described. So we have the Putin's government simultaneously becoming more authoritarian and harkening back to the authoritarian legacy of Stalin. So what does this mean? This means gulag for anybody who dares to question the war. It means certainly life sentences in the gulag for anyone called a traitor, a saboteur, a spy. Right? These are all, of course, things that can certainly be proven in any kangaroo court in Russia, just as they can be, by the way, as we see people railroaded every single day in the United States. So the state can pretty much do what it wants in any case that it wants. And I think we all know what it means if you're arrested in Russia and charged with treason, as many anarchists and others have been in the last several years. So you got to pay attention to the laws that are being put in place in Russia, because those laws, I think, indicate something more than just legal structures. They indicate a shifting political dynamic. They indicate a shift in propaganda. They indicate a shift in strategy. And I think we have to pay attention to all of that. All right, that'll be it for me for now. Talk to you all again next time.